This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be looking at the Declaration of Lima back in 1938.
Right.
And how it connects to FDR's good neighbor policy.
Interesting.
So think about it this way. It's the 1930s.
Yeah.
The world is kind of on edge, right?
Absolutely.
You've got fascism spreading in Europe and Asia.
Mm-hmm.
And the U.S. is getting a little nervous about these powers getting too much influence in Latin America.
Right in their backyard.
Yeah. It's like right in their backyard.
Yeah.
And that's where the Declaration of Lima comes into play.
Makes sense.
It was signed at the 8th Pan-American Conference. And it was supposed to be this big shift from the old way the U.S. was doing things in Latin America.
Right.
But the question is, was it really a change?
That's what we're here to find out.
Exactly. So let's break this declaration down a little.
Right.
It's all about non-intervention, peaceful resolutions, no using force, and working together.
Sounds good on paper.
Right. But it's a far cry from stuff like the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt Corollary.
Totally different approach.
Which basically said, hey, U.S., you can step in whenever you want in Latin America.
Right. Basically gave them free rein.
Exactly. So was the U.S. really turning over a new leaf here?
Well, it definitely looks like a drastic change on the surface.
Right.
The U.S. was really trying to present this image of being the good neighbor.
A good neighbor.
Respecting everyone's sovereignty and all that.
Yeah. But let's not forget.
What's that?
The U.S. had a ton of economic interests in Latin America.
Oh, absolutely. Huge investments down there.
And they needed things to be stable to protect those investments.
Stability was key, for sure.
So maybe it wasn't all about being nice.
Yeah. You gotta wonder what their true motives were.
Right. Was this genuine or just a clever way to keep their influence?
It's a tough one to answer.
And then you've got the good neighbor policy.
Right. FDR's big initiative.
Which was all about improving relations.
On paper, at least.
Exactly.
Huh?
But at the same time, they're supporting these authoritarian leaders.
Yeah. That's where things get a little murky.
It seems like a total contradiction. Preaching non-intervention while propping up dictators.
Right.
Makes you think, what were their real priorities?
It all comes down to this tension between the ideal and the reality on the ground.
Right.
The good neighbor policy, this idea of being friendly and supportive.
Yeah.
But the U.S. was also terrified of communism spreading.
Especially in the Americas.
Especially in their backyard. Yeah.
So they ended up backing some leaders who weren't exactly champions of democracy, let's say.
Not exactly poster children for democracy.
Not at all. And we've got plenty of examples of that.
Oh, tons.
The Somoza family in Nicaragua.
Yeah, a classic example.
Ruling for over 40 years.
4 decades.
With U.S. support.
And they were staunchly anti-communist.
Which seemed to be all that mattered.
Apparently so.
It makes you ask, was stopping communism more important than promoting democracy?
It's a big question to consider for sure.
It really is. And it wasn't just Nicaragua.
Yep.
There was Cuba, too.
With Batista.
Supporting Batista. And then Trujillo in the Dominican Republic.
Another dictator with U.S. support.
Right. Seems like there was a definite pattern here.
It does seem that way.
So the U.S. is trying to walk this tightrope.
Yeah, trying to balance a lot of different things.
They want to look like the friendly neighbor, but also protect their own interests and stop the spread of communism.
Which led to some questionable decisions, to say the least.
Morally ambiguous, for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
So in the end, was the good neighbor policy more about fighting communism?
Yeah.
Than actually being a good neighbor?
Historians have different interpretations.
Of course.
But the evidence suggests that the U.S. was willing to compromise on those democratic ideals.
When it was convenient.
Yeah, when it suited their goals.
It's fascinating how different people view this.
It is.
You've got the traditional view praising the non-intervention part. Then you've got the revisionists who see it as just another way to control Latin America.
Right, like a rebranding of U.S. dominance.
Exactly. And then there are those who try to find a middle ground.
The post-revisionists.
Yeah. Acknowledging both the good and the bad.
Trying to see both sides of the coin.
It's also nuanced.
Plus, history rarely has easy answers.
That's for sure. So what do you think so far?
Well, it's clear that the U.S. had a lot of different motives at play here.
Right.
And it's hard to say definitively whether the good neighbor policy was truly about being a good neighbor.
Or just about protecting their own interests.
Exactly.
It's a puzzle for sure.
It really is. It's important to remember we're not just talking about policies here.
Right.
We're talking about real people.
Exactly. These decisions affected the lives of people in Latin America.
Absolutely, their everyday lives.
So did the good neighbor policy actually make things better for them?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is.
I mean, there's no denying that the U.S. made some real efforts to improve relations.
Like what kind of thing?
Well, they pulled back troops from some countries.
Okay.
They signed trade agreements,
Yeah.
even offered financial aid.
So they were doing some good things.
Yeah, but even those actions often came with strings attached.
Oh, so there were ulterior motives, even with the good deeds.
Let's just say the U.S. was very strategic with their generosity.
Interesting.
Take their cultural programs, for example.
You okay?
They poured a lot of money into promoting American culture.
Like through what?
Hollywood films,
Okay.
jazz music,
Uh-huh.
educational exchanges, things like that.
So that's what they call soft power, right?
Exactly, using culture as a tool of diplomacy.
And it sounds like it worked.
It was pretty effective, yeah.
Because it helped create a more positive image of the U.S.
Even while they were supporting these authoritarian regimes.
So it's like they were trying to win over the people
Mm-hmm.
while controlling the politics behind the scenes.
A bit of a double game, you could say.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So how do we judge the good neighbor policy's legacy then?
It's a mixed bag, to be honest.
How so?
Well, on one hand, it did mark a shift from those direct military interventions.
Right. Fewer U.S. troops in Latin America.
Exactly. And the talk was all about partnership and cooperation.
Not about dominance.
Right. A more diplomatic approach.
And we can't forget about World War II.
True, the timing is important.
The U.S. needed allies,
Absolutely.
and the good neighbor policy helped secure support from Latin America.
It definitely played a role in that.
So in that sense, it was a success.
For sure.
But on the other hand,
Yeah.
the U.S. was still putting their own interests first.
Often at the expense of democratic values.
That same old tension between ideals and self-interest.
It keeps coming up, doesn't it?
It does, and it seems like self-interest often won out.
That's a fair assessment.
So did the good neighbor policy really change anything in the long run?
That's a tough question.
It is.
I mean, it did lay the groundwork for a more cooperative relationship.
Okay.
It helped ease some of the resentment from all the interventionism.
But it also set the stage for what came next.
What do you mean?
Well, the Cold War interventions.
Ah, yes. I see what you mean.
Things like the coup in Guatemala in '54,
Mm-hmm.
the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba,
Right. Those events showed the U.S. was still willing to use force.
even if it was covert.
Exactly. They hadn't given up on controlling the region.
So maybe the good neighbor policy was just a pause.
A temporary truce in a much bigger power struggle.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
The policy might soften things a bit.
But it didn't change the underlying dynamics.
Not really, no.
And those dynamics are still at play today, right?
Oh, absolutely. The U.S. Latin America relationship is still complex.
Full of tension, suspense.
And the legacy of all that interventionism.
So it's a complicated story.
It is.
The good neighbor policy was maybe well-intentioned,
Maybe so.
but it was a product of its time.
Shaped by the world events of that era.
So what can we learn from all of this?
Well, I think there are some valuable lessons.
Like what?
Well, one is the importance of understanding other nations.
What do you mean?
The U.S. often acted like they knew what was best for Latin America.
Without actually listening to them.
Exactly. They didn't really listen to the people.
So instead of forcing their own ideas,
Mm-hmm.
they should focus on building true partnerships.
Based on respect and understanding.
Makes sense.
And another lesson is consistency.
Oh, interesting.
The U.S. was sending mixed signals, you see.
How so?
Promoting democracy and non-intervention on one hand, but supporting dictators on the other.
It all goes back to that tension between idealism and pragmatism.
It always does.
Trying to find the right balance.
It's a challenge for foreign policy even today.
It is. And the good neighbor policy shows what can happen
What's that?
when short-term interests win out over long-term principles.
Ah, I see what you mean.
It might seem easier to support a dictator who's on your side,
In the short term, yes.
but it can cause problems down the road,
Absolutely. It often backfires.
creating instability and resentment.
Exactly.
So what's the alternative then?
Well, I think it's about a more principled approach.
Okay.
Investing in diplomacy and development.
Mm-hmm.
Promoting those democratic values, even when it's tough.
Even when it's not easy or profitable.
Exactly. It's about the long game.
Building those genuine partnerships.
Based on shared interests.
Sounds like a long and difficult road,
It can be.
but a better one in the end.
More sustainable and ethical, for sure.
And it's not about the U.S. telling everyone what to do.
Right.
It's about working together with other countries.
To face global challenges.
Like climate change and poverty.
Exactly. Those are issues that affect everyone.
And no one country can solve them alone.
That's the point the good neighbor policy teaches us, that cooperation
Domination
is the best way forward.
It's amazing how these conversations about history can be so relevant even today.
Absolutely.
We've really dug into the good neighbor policy,
We have.
all its contradictions and its impact.
It's a fascinating story.
I keep thinking about what it all means for us now.
Right, how it connects to the present.
Exactly. You talked about the importance of soft power and cultural diplomacy.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think the U.S. is doing enough of that today?
It's tough to say. I mean, the U.S. still has a lot of cultural influence around the world.
That's true.
But I think we need to move beyond just exporting American culture.
What do you mean?
It can't just be about broadcasting American values.
So it's more about...
It's about genuine exchange.
Okay.
Understanding other cultures.
Not just telling everyone how things should be.
Exactly. And this goes for U.S. foreign policy in general.
Not just with Latin America.
Right. It's about building trust and partnerships.
And that takes...
Understanding, listening to other countries' perspectives.
Not just dictating from a position of power.
That's the key.
It all comes back to that balance between idealism and self-interest.
It always does.
How can the U.S. promote democracy and human rights?
Yeah.
While also looking out for their own interests?
It's the million-dollar question, right?
It really is.
And there's no easy answer.
Right.
But the good neighbor policy is a good reminder
Of what?
that focusing on short-term gains can have consequences down the line.
You mean like supporting a dictator who's friendly to your interests?
It might seem helpful in the moment,
Right.
but it can create instability in the long run.
Lead to resentment.
Even fuel anti-American sentiment.
So what's the better way?
I think it's about a more principled approach.
Okay.
Investing in diplomacy, development assistance, promoting those democratic values, even when it's tough.
So it's about the long game.
It is.
Building real partnerships based on shared goals.
Exactly. And it's not about the U.S. controlling everything.
Right. It's about working together.
Collaborating with other nations.
To face the big challenges.
Like climate change.
Poverty.
Things that affect us all.
No one country can solve these problems alone.
That's a good point.
The good neighbor policy shows us that cooperation, not domination, is the way to go. That's a great takeaway, I think.
It's a valuable lesson from history.
Well, we've covered a lot today.
We have.
The good neighbor policy, its successes and failures,
All its complexities.
and how it relates to U.S. foreign policy now.
It's been a really interesting discussion.
It has, and I hope our listeners learned a lot.
I hope so, too.
And that they keep thinking about these issues.
Absolutely.
So thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It was a pleasure.
And we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.